Harry Truman's presidency and the Cold War. The roots of the Cold War. The U.S. point of view. Stalin seemed intent on creating spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The Yalta Conference. The Soviets' pledge to allow democratic elections in Eastern Europe was broken, including Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. Later, Czechoslovakia and Hungary were dominated by Moscow. The USSR refused to release East Germany while the US, British, and French allowed their western zones to be unified into a new democratic West Germany. The US wanted democracy spread throughout the world with a strong international organization to maintain global peace. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech warned Americans of Soviet expansion. The Soviet point of view. The US did not open the Western Front in Western Europe early enough. Millions of Soviet soldiers died fighting the brunt of the Nazi armies alone until the mid-1944. The US and the British froze Russia out of the atomic bomb project. The US terminated Lend-Lease to Moscow in 1945 and refused $6 billion in a plea from Stalin while granting Britain $3.75 billion in 1946. The Soviets wanted a security guarantee for the Soviet western border, especially in Poland. The USSR twice attacked by Germany in the 20th century. Eastern Europe would then become a buffer zone. Partitioning. Korea and Vietnam was split into northern and southern zones controlled by communists in the north and pro-democracy forces in the south. Germany was split into 4 zones, with Berlin also being split into quadrants. The issue of Berlin nearly resulted in a full-scale war in 1948. The shaping of the post-war world. The Bretton Woods Conference. The International Monetary Fund was created by Western allies. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was founded to promote economic growth in war-torn and underdeveloped areas. The Soviets declined to participate. The United Nations. The Yalta Conference. The Big Three had called for a conference on world organization to meet in 1945 in the U.S. The San Francisco Conference opened on April 25, 1945. The UN Charter created a General Assembly composed of all member nations, which would act as the ultimate policy-making body. The Security Council was composed of the US, USSR, China, Britain, and France, and 6 additional nations would be elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms. The German Question. Nuremberg Trials. The Potsdam Conference had decided on punishing war crimes and for a program of denazifying Germany. The Allies tried 22 top Nazis at Nuremberg, Germany, during 1945 and 1946. 12 Nazis were hanged and 7 were sentenced to long-term jail sentences. Legal critics in the U.S. condemned the proceedings as judicial lynchings because the victims were tried for offenses that had not been clear-cut crimes when the war began. The partitioning of Germany. The Soviets dominated their Eastern German zone after World War II. They sought to strip Eastern Germany of resources and ship them to Russia as compensation for war losses. They did not want a revitalized Germany that could once again pose a threat. The US and Western Europeans felt the German economy was vital to the recovery of Europe. In 1949, a democratic West Germany was created. Eastern Germany was created under Soviet domination. The reconstruction of Japan. Despite Soviet protests, the U.S. led by General Douglas MacArthur implemented democracy in Japan. Japanese war criminals were tried between 1946 and 1948. 7 were hanged and 18 were sent to prison. The Constitution was adopted in 1946, renouncing militarism and introducing Western-style democracy. Within decades, Japan would become an economic powerhouse. The policy of containment. In 1947, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, George Kennan, warned Truman that Russia sought to expand its empire. Soviet leaders had an ideology that the outside world was hostile and that it was their duty eventually to overthrow their political forces beyond their borders. The Soviet policy in Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Middle East was of great concern. Kennan's ideas became the basis for Truman's containment policy. The Truman Doctrine defined U.S. foreign policy for the next 20 years. It must be the policy of the U.S. to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The Truman Doctrine initiated a policy of containment, which was preventing the spread of communism. On March 12, 1947, Truman asked Congress for $400 million to support democracy in Turkey and Greece, since the British were no longer able to support them. Truman quickly recognized Israel in 1948 as the new country would be a bastion of democracy in the Middle East. The Marshall Plan, 1947. France, Italy, and Germany were still suffering from economic chaos after World War II. The U.S. feared communist parties could exploit these hardships and take control. Secretary of State George C. Marshall invited Europeans to create a joint plan for economic recovery. The U.S. would provide financial assistance. The Soviets walked out of the conference in Paris in July 1947. Congress at first balked at the huge monetary proposal, but changed course after the Soviet-sponsored coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia in February 1948, which extended the influence of communism in Eastern Europe. The plan allocated $12.5 billion over 4 years in 16 cooperating countries. Within a few years, most recipients of the plan's aid were exceeding pre-war output. Czechoslovakia initially interested in aid, but pressure from Moscow forced a veto. European nations were prohibited from accepting aid from the US and Western Europe. The Organization of American States was created to prevent communism in Latin America. The U.S. government reorganization and rearmament. The National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense. The National Security Council and Central Intelligence Agency were also created by Truman in 1948 and 1949. NSC number 68 in 1950. It was issued in response to the fall of China and onset of hostilities in Korea. The U.S. would implement a rigorous worldwide defense of communism with an immediate and large-scale buildup of our military. In 1948, there was the first peacetime military draft was enacted. The Voice of America was authorized by Congress, which beamed U.S. broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain. The Atomic Energy Commission was created in 1946, establishing civilian control over nuclear development and gave the President sole authority over the use of atomic weapons in warfare. The Berlin Airlift in 1948. Berlin, deep inside eastern Germany, was cut off from the west by Soviet forces in 1948. The Russian response to the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany. The U.S., French, and British zones in Berlin became an island inside eastern Germany. The U.S. organized a massive airlift for nearly a year. 277,000 flights, 2 million tons of supplies. Many thought World War III was inevitable, but eventually the Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949. The Cold War during Truman's second term. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created on April 4, 1949 by 12 nations including the U.S., France, Britain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Iceland, and Canada. In 1953, Turkey and Greece joined. West Germany also joined in 1954. It was created in response to the Berlin crisis, a collective security organization that essentially warned Moscow that a threat to any of the signatories would be met with force. In 1955, the USSR formed the Warsaw Pact as a response to NATO, which included all Eastern Bloc countries or satellite countries. The Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb in September 1945. The U.S. no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. China becomes communist in 1949. The U.S. supported nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek during World War II. In late 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces defeated the last of Chiang Kai-shek's forces and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. The loss of China was seen as a major defeat for the U.S. The U.S. refused to recognize the People's Republic of China and maintained Chiang Kai-shek's regime on the UN Security Council. The USSR boycotted the Security Council in protest. People's Republic of China was not recognized as a permanent Security Council member until 1973. The hydrogen bomb. The U.S. exploded the H-bomb in 1952. In 1953, the Soviets successfully exploded an H-bomb, and a nuclear arms race continued. For the first time in history, humankind had the ability to end civilization. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953. During World War II, Russian troops occupied northern Korea, while U.S. troops occupied southern Korea. Before leaving in 1949, both set up rival regimes on each side of the 49th parallel. Secretary of State Dean Acheson claimed Korea was outside essential U.S. defense perimeter in the Pacific, and U.S. forces were reduced there. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean army with Soviet-made tanks invaded South Korea and took nearly all the country. Truman resurrected NSC-68, a call to quadruple U.S. defense spending, and ordered a massive military buildup well beyond the purposes of the war. At the UN Security Council, called for members to restore peace and condemn the invasion with a vote of 9-0. The UN votes to establish UN force with Truman's choice, General Douglas MacArthur, as UN commander, who took his orders from Washington. By August 1950, North Korea captured virtually all of South Korea. MacArthur directs a surprise amphibious landing at Incheon behind Korean lines. Within 2 weeks, the UN forces recapture nearly all of South Korea as North Koreans retreat behind the 38th parallel. Although the original objective was complete, MacArthur orders UN forces to cross the 38th parallel with support of Truman and the UN. The UN calls for the establishment of a unified, independent, and democratic Korea. In November 1950, 300,000 Chinese soldiers enter into North Korea and force UN troops to retreat with heavy losses across the 38th parallel. Truman fires MacArthur. Truman seeks a limited war and announces it on November 28, 1950. MacArthur argued against this limited war, saying, "No substitute for victory." MacArthur circumvents Truman and demands total North Korean surrender. Truman removes MacArthur from command and orders him back to the U.S. The significance of this was that the civilian control of the U.S. military was reaffirmed. The ceasefire. Negotiations began in July 1951 and continue for 2 years while the war continues. The ceasefire was officially signed on July 27, 1953. The armistice is still in effect today. The 38th parallel as a boundary was restored, and the DMZ was created along the border. Americans were disappointed at the unclear conclusion because of the clear victory at World War II. The results of the Korean War. 54,000 U.S. soldiers and 3,000 UN soldiers were dead. 103,000 UN soldiers were wounded, including Americans. 2 million civilians were dead, mostly in South Korea. Over 1.5 million Chinese were dead, and North Korean soldiers were killed. The UN successfully repelled the North Korean attack on South Korea. The U.S. government demonstrated its determination to enforce containment. Truman's first term. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was passed by Congress over Truman's veto. It was a conservative response to powerful labor unions. In 1946, over 4 million workers went on strike demanding higher wages. Shutdowns in the auto, steel, electric, railroad, and maritime industries ensued. Much striking activity was orchestrated by John L. Lewis, the president of the United Mine Workers, who demanded higher pay, safer work conditions, and a small tax on coal to fund worker pensions. The major provisions of the Taft-Hartley Act. The most important was the 80-day cooling-off period for strikers in key industries. It also outlawed the closed shop. The unions, however, still flourished. The AFL had about 8 million members in 1950. The CIO had 6 million. By 1954, 15 states passed the right-to-work laws outlawing the union shop. Civil rights gains for African Americans. In 1946, Truman created the President's Committee on Civil Rights. In 1947, the committee published To Secure These Rights, calling for desegregation in American society, anti-lynching legislation, and an end to poll taxes. In 1948, the President banned racial discrimination in federal government hiring practices and ordered desegregation of the armed forces. The blacks were integrated in 1953. The Presidential Succession Act of 1947. It was created as a contingency for nuclear war. After the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, the President pro tempore, and Secretary of the State was next in line for succession. The 22nd Amendment. It limited the President to 2 terms, or a maximum of 10 years if he, as Vice President, assumed the President's duties due to the death or departure of a previous president. Largely a conservative move in the face over 17 years of continuous Democratic rule in the White House. The Anti-Communist Crusade. American fears. There was paranoia about communism, and its sympathizers began to set in due to a variety of factors. 1. Communism at home. Fear of spies infiltrating the U.S. government. 2. The fear of nuclear war. The Soviet atomic bomb in 1949, the fear of the H-bomb in 1953, and Sputnik in 1957. 3. The spread of communism around the world. Eastern Europe, the fall of China in 1949, and Korea. 4. Demagogue politicians using fear for gain, like Joseph McCarthy. 5. The fear of another depression. Recessions in 1946 and 47, and the early 50s triggered concerns. 6. The culture reflected these fears. Movies such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Blob. The Smith Act of 1940 made it illegal to advocate the overthrow of the government by force or to belong to an organization advocating such a position. It was used by the Truman administration to jail leaders of the American Communist Party. The Committee on Un-American Activities indicts Alger Hiss in 1947. HUAC was created in 1945 to root out communism during the Red Scare after World War II that lasted into the mid-1950s. The committee was sensationalistic, including going after public figures in Hollywood. Liberals and members of the New Deal were also targeted. The center counterpart to the HUAC was also active in anti-communist investigations. Richard Nixon led the movement to indict Alger Hiss, a distinguished member of the Eastern establishment. He was also a prominent ex-New Dealer and current member of the U.S. State Department. Hiss denied being a communist agent in the 1930s, but was convicted of perjury in 1950 and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The case brought Nixon national prominence, and he was eventually elected vice president 5 years later. Truman's loyalty program. Truman countered HUAC with an anti-communist program of his own. The Attorney General identified 90 disloyal organizations who were not given the right to prove their innocence. Truman gave the FBI approval and resources to go after suspected Reds. The Loyalty Review Board investigated more than 3 million federal employees. Loyalty oaths were increasingly demanded of employees, especially teachers. Many felt civil liberties were being suppressed. The government employees were forbidden to 1. Criticize U.S. foreign policy, 2. Advocate equal rights for women, 3. Own books on socialism, and 4. Attend foreign films. The McCarran Internal Security Bill, 1950. It required the Communist Front organizations to register with the Attorney General and prevented their members from defense work and travel abroad. Truman vetoed this bill, which authorized the president to arrest and detain suspicious persons during an internal security emergency. Many felt this bill was a step towards a police state, but Congress passed it anyway. The Rosenbergs in 1954. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and executed for allegedly giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. Both, however, were avowed communists. Blacklisting. Many actors, writers, and directors had dabbled with the Communist Party in the 1930s when it was considered fashionable. 10 of these movie industry people, the Hollywood 10, refused to testify and decided to go to prison rather than testifying to the HUAC claiming protection from the Constitution. The industry responded by denying work to 250 actors, writers, and directors. McCarthyism. Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, the Republican from Wisconsin, became a demigod. In February 1950, he asserted that scores of unknown communists were in the Department of the State. His technique was to make sweeping accusations, employ guilt by association, and documents out of context. The public was convinced he was looking out for national security. However, he was unable to substantiate his claims but ruined many government officials. Almost no one was safe from his accusations. Supporters tended to be Republican and blue-collar. His other accusations were that he claimed that the Democratic Party was guilty of 20 years of treason. He wanted Truman impeached for being soft on communism. He also claimed George Marshall was an instrument of Soviet conspiracy. and he also hinted that Eisenhower was soft on communism. McCarthy would eventually slander people and claim they were homosexual as well as communist. McCarthy's Senate hearings created an atmosphere of conformity and fear. Eisenhower despised McCarthy, but did little to oppose him. Eventually, McCarthy overtook his boundaries, and eventually he created his own downfall when he took on the army in 1954. McCarthy was intensely examined by Joseph Welch, the Army Attorney. By December 1954, the Senate passed a resolution condemning McCarthy 67 to 22. McCarthy died 3 years later from alcohol and exhaustion. The end of the McCarthy era did not signal the end of the Red Scare, however. For a variety of reasons, Sputnik caused some hysteria in 1957. Americans feared Soviets were technologically superior. Also, many Americans built bomb shelters in their backyards fearing nuclear war with Soviets. Schools continued duck and cover drills to prepare for a nuclear attack. The John Birch Society, an ultra-conservative nationalist group, emerged in the late 1950s. Aggressive rooting out of suspected communists still existed. The election of 1948. The Democrats were split into three camps: Truman, Southern States Rights Party led by Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, and the New Progressive Party, who nominated Henry Wallace. Thomas Dewey was nominated by the Republicans, and Earl Warren served as his VP nominee. Their platform included anti-big labor plank and the reduction of New Deal policies. Truman, however, called for housing, full employment, and the higher minimum wage, better farm supports, new Tennessee Valley authorities, and extensions of Social Security and more civil rights for African Americans. Truman's victory came with support from farmers, workers, and African Americans who felt threatened by the Republicans. The Democrats established a clear majority in both houses of Congress, however. The Vital Center. A political consensus developed in America, although bitter political wrangling continued to characterize America. The three major components to the Vital Center was common in both major parties. One was anti-communism and containment. Two, the belief that economic growth can solve all of society's problems. And three, political pluralism, the belief that a variety of ideas can compete in America. The Vital Center elected Truman in 1948, Eisenhower in 52 and 56, Kennedy in 1960, and Johnson in 64. The flaws in the Vital Center. The Vietnam War exposed problems with containment. As many as 25% of Americans lived in poverty. The economic boom did not lift all boats. Jim Crow also demonstrated a lack of true pluralism in America. The Vital Center is shattered in 1968. The Vietnam War pitted hawks against doves, and it amplified the generation gap. White conservative backlash against liberalism. The Great Society programs of Johnson, the Civil Rights Movement, and there was an apparent lack of law and order. Truman's Fair Deal. The only major successes were raising the minimum wage, public housing, and extending old age insurance to more beneficiaries. The Secretary of Agriculture's proposed program of continued price supports for farmers failed to be passed by Congress, and surpluses continued to pile up. In essence, Truman was able to preserve New Deal programs, but was unable to add to it. The coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats prevented little more than the maintenance of existing programs. Truman decides not to run for re-election in 1952. The military deadlock in Korea, the war-induced inflation, and other White House scandals. Adlai Stevenson runs on the Democratic ticket against Dwight D. Eisenhower. The election of 1952, Eisenhower defeated Stevenson 442 to 89, and Nixon was his VP. American society in the post-World War II era, the GI Bill of Rights. It was a response to unemployment fears resulting from 15 million men returning from World War II. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 sent millions of veterans to school. A majority of these individuals attended technical and vocational schools. The Veterans Administration guaranteed about $16 billion in loans for veterans to buy homes, farms, and small businesses. The baby boom. In the 1950s, the population grew by over 28 million. 97% were in urban and suburban areas. Between 1946 and 1961, 63.5 million babies were born. The proportional growth in the population was unprecedented in American history. The economic boom in the 1950s and 1970s, the affluent society. The national income nearly doubled in the 1950s. It almost doubled again in the 1960s. Americans enjoyed about 40% of the world's wealth, despite accounting for only 6% of the population. By the mid-1950s, 60% of Americans owned their own homes compared with only 40% in the 1920s. The majority of post-war jobs went to women in urban offices and shops. The economy was largely fueled by the growth of the defense industry. Cheap energy and increased supply of power facilitated growth. The rising productivity due to increases in education and technology increased the average American standard of living by 2. Consumerism mushroomed as Americans had more disposable income. The middle class. There was about 5.7 million in 1947, and it grew to over about 12 million by the early 1960s. The suburbs grew 6 times faster than cities in the 1950s. This resulted from the increase of car production, the white flight from urban areas due to black migration into northern and midwestern cities, and government policies that ensured both builders and homeowners. The cult of domesticity reemerges. A few advocated that science supported the idea that women could only find fulfillment as a homemaker. The concept of a woman's place being in the home was widespread in magazines, TV, and society in general. TV shows included Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, and Leave It to Beaver. Dr. Benjamin Spock, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. It sold an average of 1 million copies per year between 1946 and 1960. His message was that women's primary responsibility was to stay home and nurture their children. The end.